Hi, and welcome to the Red Tunic Podcast, a podcast where I look to rediscover what makes gaming fun and enjoyable by having a positive conversation with those related to the industry. My name is Link, and today I'm joined by Akabaka, developer for the up-and-coming Chromatose and Sucker for Love, First Date, both being visual novels with their own unique twists, and both currently having demos available on Steam. Hi Akabaka, how are you doing today?
Hi, doing great. How are you?
I'm doing all right, thanks so much for asking. So, Akabaka, for those that aren't aware of who you are or what you do, would you mind telling me and the listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. I'm a Baltimore-based developer that makes primarily uh, anime-inspired role-play games and visual novels. Chiefly, that would be my Chromatose game and my Sucker for Love game. To kind of trim them down to a few, Chromatose is about being trapped in a coma with a bunch of other comatose patients who need to go back through their memories and undo mistakes that put them in a coma in order to wake up in 12 hours where they never do. And then Sucker for Love is uh it is a it's a dating sim where you try to smooch eldritch whores.
So, thank you for the succinct introduction there, and I can definitely understand. I don't want to say the hesitation, but the way you um, were working yourself into Love, only because it's such a fascinating twist on the whole visual novel dating sim. And I don't mean to dismiss or disregard Chromatose, because that also is a very interesting way to go about it. And I've looked into it and the whole RPG element or aspects of it as well. And both are very interesting and have, that unique twist. But Sucker for Love, the demo Prelude, whatever you want to call, which was included in the Dread X, I believe it's the Prelude. Um, it was presented in such a almost wholesome way, and I say almost because all things considered, it's eldritch horror, and the scenario around what you're doing or trying to do um, is somewhat terrifying, but it's such a wholesome approach to weird a perfect like an amazingly weird Venn diagram of things that usually don't overlap. If that makes any sense to what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, no, it does. uh, Horror and romance is like my favorite genre combination personally, and so um this it was kind of a natural product for me to generate, especially with the prompt for the Drugs 2 collection being we had to make something that had love mechanics, crafting mechanics, and Lovecraftian horror. Basically, a Lovecraftian dating sim was pretty much the only thing I could come up with in the short time, and it, ultimately, I think I'm pretty. It's exactly the type of game that I would play, for better or worse.
And and that's fantastic that is what you ended at with the constraints that they gave.
Hmm.
Um, and because you kind of I do agree with what you said, that the horror elements and like the love aspect or what have you are are a very interesting way to overlap. And would it be a stretch to say that, as a developer of visual novels, um or at least, into that vein, that you are a fan of them?
Of visual novels or of
Yes.
yes, yeah, I am.
So with that in mind, uh and I apologize if you've been asked this before and it's an overdone question, but what made you want to take the wholesome approach? Because from my understanding, typically when a visual novel is going to have the horror aspect, but still kind of have the love aspect or the romance aspect, it's rarely presented in such a wholesome way. And I could be wrong; I'm not an expert, but what made you lean into such a wholesome aspect for it? Uh, yeah.
Yeah, it is it is atypical, but it isn't necessarily rare. I think for visual novels and indie games to uh, you know bait you in with something cute and then hit you over the head with a baseball bat of horror. I mean, got, Doki Doki Literature Club. It looks like it's going to be a silly visual novel dating sim, but it's actually a psych horror. Um, in a way, Five Nights at Freddy's 2 was well, Five Nights at Freddy's as well, not 2, is, taking something somewhat cute, animatronics, and then turning it into high horror. I feel like that's that it creates kind of an interesting dichotomy from the get go, and so that's what the plan was with Sucker for Love, to kind of give off the facade of it being, hey, look, it's a silly, lighthearted anime sim where you date a monster girl, which is common, and then I kind of subvert the expectations of that, and it's almost a double subversion, because instead of being like, hey, guess what, it looks like it was going to be super cute, but it's actually a high horror. I almost promised from the beginning that it was going to be horror because you're dating a Lovecraftian horror.
And I you're right. I forgot completely about, for example, Doki Doki Literature Club, about
Mhm.
how that one kind of uh, you know, uh, brought you in and tricked you, so to say.
Mhm.
So, it's it's you're right, and I just love the idea of what you're doing with Sucker for Love, and hopefully it succeeds because having a little more palatable horror visual novels in like that in my mind are great, because a lot of the horror romance ones I've seen in the past, they lean very hard into horror in a much harder form to digest,
Mhm.
if that makes any sense to you. And again, I'm not an expert, but the ones I have seen are very hard to digest, for myself at least.
Yeah, it's interesting you say that. Accessibility is always something I'm looking at. I'm not sure if it's going to be in the game, like if we end up getting enough time. But one thing I was actually considering doing is putting a small little meta, uh, like jump scares disabled mode. Essentially, I found out from the first demo that went out that a lot of people wanted to play it, but are kind of weenies with horror, which I am too. And although they were very interested in playing, just wouldn't be able to put up with the scares and the jump scares and the startling events. And so, one thing I was considering putting in, and might if I have enough time, is a sort of protected mode where you get a warning before a jump scare happens, so that people that aren't accustomed to horror aren't. It's not prohibitively scary for them to be able to play.
And as someone that was quite startled by the jump scares that you did have, um, I think they're relatively minor. However, I think that's a great thing to do. And as someone who's a fan of accessibility options in games, I think that's a wonderful idea. And if you have, like, I hope you do have the time to do that, because it I just think it's a fantastic way to, go about it. So that way people can relax and play it and still enjoy the horror-ish elements, but not have to worry about something jumping out and, actively disrupting them or ruining their mood or
Yeah.
their comfort.
Yeah, no, people that people. Some people like them, some people hate them. It's being able to turn it off for somebody that wants it turned off is always a plus, I think.
Definitely. So, Akabaka, if you don't mind, can you explain how it is you got into developing and making games? And, as well, based on the experiences that you had getting into that, what kind of advice you could give for those seeking to also get into the industry?
Sure. So, um, I've been doing things akin to dungeon mastering since I was a kid. I think when Super Smash Brothers Melee came out on the GameCube, they had this thing called Adventure Mode, which is where you got to take the characters from the roster on sort of this fantastical adventure through the game, like spanning. Sometimes you do a level that was based from Super Mario, or one times you get one from Metroid, so on and so forth. And it's like I thought, I think that's kind of where it all began for me with, um, sort of taking these cool characters, putting them through crazy stories, I then started uh, uh, asking for Bionicles and Legos and toys for my birthday so that I could do the same stories for my little brother. And so when we played together, I would be like the dungeon master, kind of controlling all the NPCs, and he'd have his own character, and I'd be coming up with the story that way. And after years and years of doing that, it evolved into me being like a dungeon master for my friends, where in lieu of like um stats and abilities and dice rolls. It was purely like a homebrew. You make a decision and then you face the consequences. And after years of doing that and getting really attached to these characters and their stories and their backstories and personalities, I thought it was kind of a shame that I wasn't going to be able to share all this stuff I put so much work into with anyone besides these five other nerds sitting around a table. So I pursued a couple of different mediums to try to share that story with other people, including like a 2D pixel art type thing, and even an animation, very briefly, until I kind of settled on like an RPG being the best format to convey the types of stories that I like to tell, because they give you lots of options for making decisions and acting out your character. And from there, I started making games like Chromatose, which was my first game, and I'm still working on it. But um, that is kind of how I arrived at making these highly interactive, your decisions matter type experiences for visual novels and video games. And then, if you said advice for people getting into this, I would say number one, I learned the hard way, but make your first game very short. um, uh, well, so I've been on Chromatose maybe 3 years or so by now, from its beginning, and uh, I've I've learned a lot from this experience. Is one way to say it. Um, um, it's I would definitely recommend making many short games inspired by whatever you're most interested in. Like if you've got a favorite game, try figuring out what's your favorite about it, and then making a short game about that. I think is a kind of recipe for success, because these games that usually do well are usually passion projects inspired by the developers' like favorite games. And so if you do that and you keep the game very small in scale, I think you're setting yourself up for success.
And thank you, because that's great advice. To keep it small and to also find things that you like from other games or what have you, and to try and incorporate that into like a little tiny project and go from there. I I really like the DMing, if you will, approach
Mhm.
that you took for your little brother with Bionicles, and then kind of homebrewing for your friends. I especially like the idea that you weren't really having to do, well, at least it sounded like you weren't really having to do dice rolls and checks and balances in the traditional sense, and that you were more, playing it out on a very narrative driven style. And I really like the idea of that, just because it allows for real free form things, and then you kind of just have your own internal checks and balances for throwing it back at them to see what kind of things happen. And I just really like that as well. And I find it absolutely wild that you started with Bionicles and setting them up and just giving your siblings a a custom, bespoke little adventure using those toys.
Yeah.
So, Kabaka, um, what was your favorite game as a child, and what was it about that game that made it your favorite?
So that was probably the Smash Brothers Melee for the reason that I said with the adventure mode. It was getting to take all the characters on the crazy adventures. I think um, that, and a little bit later, I also liked the what do you call it? The Persona series is probably the next, a little like further down the line after Smash Brothers, was probably that influenced my storytelling, was very much Persona, like Persona 3, and Persona 4 for the pretty much the same reason, the heavy role play, um the heavy uh emphasis on playing out your character and your relationships with the other characters, which I think is how I got started on making so many games that have romance mechanics. Is the Persona games had these things called social links where you could spend times with characters, and eventually, after listening to them talk about themselves 7 or 8 times, they fall in love with you. And um, the I'm just kind of a sucker for games that have romance mechanics in them, just because they let you it immediately gives you a reason to care about the story. You know, I was like, hey, there's this character and they exist. You're like, oh, okay. It's like, hey, this character exists and they are your partner, like boyfriend or girlfriend. You're like, oh, okay. And so, um, it's somewhat it's a little bit of a of plot hijacking. Like it's a little bit of a trick to get people to care, but it's also I just really enjoy it.
And, I completely agree on the Persona side of things for RPGs. And it was, in my mind, it was a really great way to take the series. I know that that's kind of, split and divided for some people. Usually the real old fans, which luckily I am not, so I can say this without any form of issue. But I think that was one of the things that really kind of made it more palatable in just in general, because you're right, because you immediately formed bonds with characters, and it wasn't even like it was a well, it was an optional thing technically, but it wasn't even like it was a optional thing in the sense that it was just there to do if you wanted at your leisure, right? It was there to do because you could easily gamify it to raise your stats for your in battle allies, the S links for the different arcanas and such. And that was like such a, I don't want to say underhanded, but it was such subverted, or that's still even the wrong word. It was such a um, low key, I guess, way to sort of slip in that game mechanic and give you a reason to actually bond with the characters,
Hmm.
instead of just letting you do it and making it a thing that only some people are going to do, you know?
Yeah, and that was uh that was also one point of divergence between me and Persona is that um one of my pet peeves with roleplay games is like silent main characters. Um that's my only kind of gripe with their social link system is that they're trying to show like a relationship growing between you and this other character, but your character is like dead silent, and so most of your bonding, most of your relationships is just the other character talking about themselves at great length and then falling in love with you for listening to them. And so one thing that I try to do is when you come into a like whenever most of my games you can't really customize your character. Like in Chromatose, you have to play as Leroy, a very specific person with a very specific personality. And in Sucker for Love First Date, you have to play as D, who also has like a set personality, set appearance, and everything. That way, when he interacts with the other characters in the game, I can show dynamism between them. I can show conflict. I can show interesting back and forths that I think are kind of missing when one of them is just listening. And so that's another sort of design element that went into the games that I make.
And that's a really interesting way to do it, and I understand where you're coming from, and I think that's a great thing because while some games like for Persona and other JRPGs where they treat you as the blank slate so that you can easily or better impart or reflect yourself into them and all of that, uh, and that's okay for some people, but having a set story where you are playing as someone and you get to see, you know, maybe that person uh, doing things that you wouldn't typically do, but at the same time, you're telling a narrative story and you're giving them direction where they're playing a person and not themselves. And I think that's a great way to do it, because I appreciate both. I appreciate getting to participate in a story as well as getting to lead the story. And I hope Well, I shouldn't say hope. I'm fairly confident that you understand what I'm saying, and most people that have played JRPGs also probably have an idea of what I'm trying to say with that.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I definitely, some people just want, self-insert characters, and that's, that's fine. It really is a matter of taste at the end of the day. I just personally believe, in a fantasy world where you can be whoever you want. I don't understand why you would choose to just be yourself. When you can be anybody or anything. you know uh, Sometimes it might be a little bit more fun to play somebody cooler than you, or somebody meaner than you, or somebody richer than you. It's all fantasy. So it's surprising to me that so many of these isekai type games, or isekai type stories, or fantasy games just involve you basically being who you already are, if not someone worse.
Yes, and I completely understand where you're coming from there. And for those that don't exactly know what an isekai is, it's a genre that has come out of Japan for from light visual novels, not visual novels, light visual or just light novels. Sorry, where it's basically the main character is transported to another world. In a lot of cases, it is by death in the current world, and they get a chance to be reborn. And like you said, typically they do not try to better themselves. And in some cases, they just become worse versions of themselves because now they feel they have less scrutiny, I guess you would say, less reason to not be who they were. Um, but yeah, no, I completely understand what you're saying. And yeah, I think that's a good approach for being. I think that's a good approach for being able to tell a narrative story, and I can definitely understand why someone that started as a DMing things would also gravitate towards that because if you're already used to telling all these stories where you make these characters that are going to be interacting and talking and having conflicts and such, I can it's very easy to see how you get from point A to point B. And I think most people that do a lot of or have done a lot of uh, DMing and such typically have a good grasp of narrative direction. At least that is my understanding and my experience. Yeah, I know I don't I shouldn't say that for certainty. However, as I said, I imagine you have a good idea of what you're trying to do and probably execute it relatively well.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I agree. It definitely is a matter of taste. Some people like being themselves. Some people like being someone different. Just to make an example, like say another one of my favorite games, Bayonetta. I'm pretty sure that like 90% of the player base is not sexy 6 foot tall women in high heels. But nonetheless, I'm sure they enjoy playing.
Yeah, 100%. I really enjoyed playing Bayonetta for a myriad of reasons, and one of them was the sheer insanity of what you got to do. And if I don't know if this is the right way to put it, but also being able to play as a crazy, I forget how old she is, but like as a crazy, incredibly old witch woman that is arguably a real badass
Yeah,
gets to go out and do her stuff, and you get to just watch all this stuff happening as all this crazy stuff is happening on the screen. You're like, oh, I'm doing this, and you're playing as someone that is typically underrepresented in games,
yeah,
and I think that's great. And I enjoyed myself. I had no qualms with it. I know some people probably did, and I don't really care about those people's opinions on the matter, but yeah, no, I understand what you're saying. Yeah, I agree. Getting to view a different person's narrative um, is always fun, right?
yeah, exactly.
So kind of, I think we already kind of touched on this. Um, so this is, it's kind of a two-part question. It's probably going to have a little bit of crossover. But how do you enjoy gaming now, and what is it that makes gaming like? What is it that makes it enjoyable to you now?
Mm, let's see. So right now, the kinds of games I play are let me open up my Steam really quick. So let's see. The the games I play right now are I play a lot of horror games and I play a lot of um uh yeah, that's pretty much right now. Right now, I'm really ever since Ted suggested I make a game for the Dreadix 2 collection. I've just been on a crazy horror binge because I didn't realize I was into horror until I was forced to make a horror game. um, but yeah, I'm seeing stuff like Dead by Daylight, Darkest Dungeon, World of Horror, Five Nights at Freddy's, stuff like that. Basically because um, my favorite thing to do in games. Oh yeah, and Catherine, of course. Duh. Catherine's like my favorite game of all time. If I probably haven't mentioned that in this interview, but I've mentioned it maybe 10 times in every other one I've been in. But I like horror a lot because seeing all the ways that people can come up with new ways to scare you or give you goosebumps is really exciting. Um, you know, um, it's very hard, I think, for horror to go stale just because as long as you're scary it's always something new. I feel like you, I can um with a horror game it's very very hard to be bored when you're scared out of your pants. And so I've been into World of Horror, lots of Junji Ito stuff. I think I bought like 10 Junji Ito books just because the stuff that he comes up with is just um, mind-boggling. Yeah, so creative scares, creative situations, and then creative gameplay. So I think that's why Hideo Kojima is like one of my favorite developers because he just comes up with some really nut stuff that makes you really question what's a video game.
Yeah, yes, very, very fair. Um, there's a few things I want to touch on here, or at least I want to follow up on. The first being, um, for someone that is also kind of getting into horror games, it was the Dread X games that I sort of first stepped into and was enjoying, and they were nice little bite-sized portions. Able to just sample them and find out what kind of horror is most enjoyable for me. In my case, it's the games that you aren't actively being pursued by something all of the time, if that makes sense. Like for example, the first Amnesia game, I didn't enjoy that much. Alien Isolation, I believe it is.
Mm-hmm.
I struggled to enjoy because, well, I know that you have, chunks of downtime, chunks of time to breathe. It was the anxiety and frustration that, at any given time, that timer could just click and suddenly it's go time for the monster to be re-engaging with me. And, I've learned through the Dread XP games what kind of stuff I'm enjoying. I'm wondering, what kind of horror games are you enjoying? Like, what kind of aspects of a horror game um, or make it a game that you're going to play, and what kind of aspects of horror games kind of aren't for you?
Yeah, so I really like um, games that have a lot of tension and atmosphere, um, and um, don't really rely on like jump scares to be scary. I know that's kind of like a big uh, uh, I don't know, like a cliche of people hating jump scares and liking bone chilling atmospheric A24 movies and horrors, but that is kind of my type. I do kind of like weird horror, weird scares. Like my favorite horror game uh, right now is probably like a tie between like in terms of horror, like Catherine and World of Horror, which are two games that don't have jump scares in them. World of Horror is like the Junji Ito roguelike type game. I think it's published by Yizbird Games, and that's the developer Panstash. And then Catherine is the Atlas published game, where it's like eating sim horror. And neither game has jump scares in it, in its core gameplay, and they're both very, very, very atmospheric with very strong art direction, which is what I kind of vibes with. So very artsy, very unique, very atmospheric horrors that don't really rely on jump scares to be creepy and give you goosebumps. I think is my favorite.
And yeah, that makes sense. And I think I've been always meaning to play Catherine as a fan of the Shin Megami Tensei in general. It's always kind of been on my list. My significant other actually owns it, and I've just never played it. Um, but yeah, I've been meaning to play it, knowing that it's kind of a horror game, and I'm kind of doing a horror dive. I'm gonna look into it because I didn't realize it was horror, and that's good to know. Um,
Oh yes.
I knew that it was somewhat psychological. I just didn't know to what extent. And the Junji Ito game, World of Horror, I didn't realize it was a roguelike. And you saying that magic word also has now me perked up to take a closer look at that. So thank you.
Yeah, no problem.
Um,
The
oh,
Go ahead.
sorry.
Go ahead. I
No,
was
no,
just gonna
please,
say
please.
the horror elements of Catherine are basically, to trim everything down to a fuse, is you are a guy who accidentally has an affair on his well, girlfriend, possibly gonna be a fiance. And as a result, he starts getting nightmares about the things haunting him. And so during the day, it's like a dating sim while you're choosing between these two girls, your fiance or this new flame that's popped up. And then at night, you have nightmares of the thing haunting the characters in the form of you having to climb up this tower of blocks that's slowly falling away into ether while being chased by some like 6 story tall monstrous form of either of something from your that's haunting you during the day. Like when your fiance is suspected to be pregnant, a giant like 6 story baby starts crawling after you while you're trying to escape, while it's screaming like "da da da da." It's absolutely scary. And uh, it definitely really works up your anxiety because you're supposed to be like pushing these blocks around to make a path to the top, all the while you're being chased. And so it's that kind of horror mechanic where you have to think clearly whilst being like actively chased by something.
And thank you for that because I've seen gameplay and it never. I don't know if I just didn't connect the dots or never playing it, never knew. But I didn't know that the thing that was pushing the timer was the character's anxiety from their day or from the current events. So that's cool to know, and thank you for that because like I said, I that makes me a little more interested in getting to finally getting time to actually sit down and play it when I've been waiting to try and find time for literal years at this point.
Yeah, I'll definitely play the original over full body. I think though there's two versions. There's the original classic, and then there's the um remake, which is full body, which adds in a couple more content. But I think the original is a little bit more um it's a little what's the word? It's a little bit more of a clean cut, straight shot game, while the full body adds in some extra stuff that I don't think really works very well for it. Um, but yeah, definitely give it a shot. I'm trying I'm trying to talk anyone that'll listen to me into playing it because I think it's like a perfect game.
Yeah, and like I said, you just mentioning it was horror kind of has sold me. So yeah, cool.
Mhm.
I'll take a look at that and I'll keep in mind what you said about the original being a little clean cut. I'm presuming what I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but I'm presuming what you mean there is with the added stuff. It kind of maybe made things a little sloppier, whereas everything's packaged a little nicer in the original.
Yeah, yeah. They added in a third love interest that kind of muddles the dichotomy that was really strong between the first two, and so um, it I think the first one is just a neater story.
And thank you because that makes sense, and I'll keep that in mind when I'm taking a look and doing my best to track everything down.
Great.
So so Akabaka, there's something I really quickly wanted to touch on. Um, what is it about Hideo Kojima and his narrative style and everything that you go for? And I know that can be a very vague question. I apologize if it is.
Because the guy is nuts. there is there's so Hideo Kojima is just off the wall crazy with his game design, and I love it. It's um I really love, like I said earlier, I really love unique ideas, and Hideo Kojima is that in spades. Like, I don't know how much you've heard about his old escapades, but like when he was on, I think when he was making Metal Gear Solid Snake Eater or one of the other Metal Gear Solid games, he wanted to coat the CDs in dried blood so that when you got to a certain scene, your computer would heat up and would make your room smell like blood for like a bloody scene. And he just that's pretty much part of the course for his ideas. He's done crazy things like put himself in the game as the character Hideo Kojima. He did that one thing in Snake Eater where you're caught with an enemy sniper who's going to die of old age in a week, and if you turn off your game and come back a week later, he's died of old age, and you don't have to fight him. Like, um, he really he really keeps it fresh and really, you know, really thinks to himself. He really asks himself the question, what is a video game and what can we do with it? And you get really weird, really interesting outcomes with questions like that, like Death Stranding, which I loved. I thought it was incredible. Same with Phantom Pain. Um, but my biggest attraction to his games and his work are that he's eventually you're just going to come to something in one of his games that just blows your mind with how he even thought about putting something like that inside of a game. Like, thanks to Hideo Kojima, now I know what it looks like when Norman Reedus is peeing in a stream in Death Stranding.
So, yes, thank you. And it's I know that for some people that's such a could or should be such an obvious question or such a boring question, if you will, just because it's Hideo Kojima. But at the same time, you nailed it. He's absolutely crazy, and it's absolutely fantastic to see what kind of crazy stuff he just wants to do. But I love that question, and I love asking it to people that say they like him, just because it's like you said, you have your own crazy things that you've experienced from his games that you can cite, and it's not always going to be the same. For example, I don't think I've ever heard someone say, I now get to know what it looks like to see Norman Reedus pee in a river. But that's one of the things you took away for what made you love what he did, because of just how bananas it is to be like, okay, well, we need you to mocap peeing in that stream for us. Just go over there and pretend to pee. Like, just it's not so much just the aspect of it existing. It's the amount of steps. I'm now, correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm presuming it's the thought process and the amount of steps that it would have taken to get from point A to point B is the whole package for what you just what you enjoy, right?
Yeah, and it's just he so he has a lot of like wild, crazy like ideas that are here and there, but then every now and then he'll just kind of strike gold that completely changes the video game scene because he thought of something that nobody even thought to do. Like, I'm pretty sure he was responsible for Psycho Mantis reading your memory card to tell you what other games you play, like having a boss look you in the eye and say, "You like Super Monkey Ball too, don't you?" Like, that might be like one of the earlier like one of the earliest fourth wall breaks I can think of, back like way in early Psycho Mantis Metal Gear Solid. And I feel like things like that paved the way for like Doki Doki Literature Club, like learning what your first name is by reading your environmental variables on your computer, and other games messing around with your computer background or your files to add scares. I feel like, you know, someone has to come up with something crazy in order to come up with something like that just completely innovates an entire genre of gaming, I think. And so having somebody that's just churning out these crazy wild ideas, it means he's eventually going to come up with something so like revolutionary that it's just going to once again, you know, change the trajectory of what people are making.
I understand what you're saying, and yeah, I think you're absolutely right that someone has to take that first step for other people to be able to follow, right? Um, Now, well, as much as I'd love to continue on this path, because I'm sure there's many different things and many different crazy things that could be said about Hideo Kojima. At the same time, though, I don't want to take up too much of your more of your time because I know that you are a busy person working on two games. One coming up, one that I believe the Prelude just became available, and all of that. So there were a few questions I wanted to make sure we got to before I stop stealing your time.
Hmm.
So Akabaka, one of the things that you wanted to discuss, and I am interested in hearing about this as well. What game did you enjoy that you don't feel got enough credit?
So that was Catherine 100%. So um, Catherine, the game I described earlier, was despite being by Atlas, who had shipped like Persona titles between Catherine, um, was kind of panned when it came out. People didn't really get it. People didn't really play it. People barely heard of it. And nowadays, whenever I bring it up, like people don't even know what I'm talking about when I mention it. It's really surprising to me that it didn't do well when it came out, when it had all of the fixings of what made other games made by Atlas popular. Like I think it was, if I heard correctly, it used the UI and 3D modeling that was later. It was the prototype for Persona 5's like stylishness. Like when you Persona 4 and Persona 3 used kind of low res, small like chibi models, and then Persona 5 made the leap to full sized, highly detailed, like rendered environments. And Catherine was the stepping stone to get there. And then people also like, the waifus in Persona. And Catherine is all about dating. So it's it was just really surprising to me that people passed passed on it. And I'm not sure if it was a matter of branding, like they pass by it and they see a very provocative anime girl on the front and they think it's going to be the anime version of Leisure Suit Larry or something, one of those, very very smut bait type games. But it's got audio made by Shoji Meguro, art made by Shigenori Soejima, which are the composer and the artist for the flagship Persona games. It's got a tight story, compelling gameplay, and all in all, the art, story, and gameplay all blend together so seamlessly that it's what I believe is truly like a flawless 10 out of 10, 100 out of 100 game that I think if people gave it a chance would really love. But it seems just to have. I think the problem wasn't maybe people didn't get it as much as it was people didn't try it. And so that's why whenever someone will listen to me talk about it, I talk about it to great length. But yeah, so all the folks listening to this podcast, go play Catherine. You have it as the Akabaka stamp of approval. It is good, I promise.
Yeah, and like I said, it's always been on my list, but the things you've said about it have only really pushed it further up on my list of to make time for or try and find time for. And I never really thought about it, but I think you're absolutely correct in that the character models, the art style, what have you, the 2D style for Persona 3, 4, 5, and Catherine and such, they are all very similar, but the shift from what Persona 3 and 4 did for their 3D model and styles and such. For Catherine, you're right. It is very close to Persona 5, and I I don't think I don't think I would want to try and argue with you that that's there was other factors in there, because it really does look like that might have been where they kind of shopped the idea, so to say, and we're trying it because like I said, I see it. And I agree completely that um that is like a very similar style, and I've never actually looked at or thought of it that way before. But that's a great perspective. So thank you.
Yeah, and then only other title I feel the same way about is Persona 5 Strikers. It is also, it looks like it's going to be like a spin-off of Persona 5, but once again, it's got a really tight story, really good music, and then the gameplay is also really fun. if not an improvement on the original title. So it was one of those the it was one of oh, and then also Persona Q. Persona Q, Catherine, and Persona Strikers, all for the same reason of it looked like it was just going to be like a spin-off side hustle type game to be a cash grab, but was actually, in my opinion, like superior in every way to the actual flagship games.
And I am Persona Strikers, 5 Strikers. That's on my list. I'm not gonna. I can't speak too much to it, only because I haven't beat Persona 5 yet. Myriad of reasons. Um, the short and long of it is I screwed up in 3, and or I screwed up in 5 on the PS, like on the first version. Um, after a few dungeons and got to a place where I just didn't have what I needed to continue on, and I knew that the golden version, so to say, would be coming. So I waited for Royal and just haven't had time for it. So I have to beat that before Strikers and all that fun stuff.
Hmm.
But I have heard only good things about it, so that's um, great to hear from what you said to know that if I was down for what 5 presented, I'm only going to be happier with it. Um, Persona Q, that's an interesting game to bring up. Not because I'm dismissing it, not because I'm saying I disagree. It's just an interesting game to bring up because you're it doesn't seem like a lot of people don't seem to know that the Q1 and Q2, the Labyrinth games, that they exist. And I think for those that are fans of Atrician Odyssey or more classic first person dungeon crawl RPG games where you have, a handful of characters, a front row, a back row, all that stuff. Um,
Hmm.
I think it's kind of a shame because, while I might not agree with everything Persona Q did, I think it was a very interesting way to let people play an Atrician Odyssey or a dungeon crawl game like that, where it's kind of a little more focused, in the same way that the Atrician Odyssey Untold Story series did, which I think they dropped. But instead of letting you just make a character and having you kind of experiment yourself into a corner, you're kind of given characters X, Y, and Z, and you are going to play with characters that in the Persona Q games, familiar characters that are going to be crafted in such a way that are much harder to mess up or to break in a negative way. Definitely with the first Persona Q, at least, there was a very fun and easy meta to break the game. After about the mid game, I think it was.
Was it the Myriad Arrows exploit, or was it
It wasn't so much an exploit. It was abusing Naoto's or however you want to pronounce it. Her status ailment effects that you could just abuse with that, and then just pumping. I think it was using Aegis and Kenji to basically just pump them up real hard so that you could then do a lot of damage with one of them, by just buff boosting them and buff boosting an enemy that's like poisoned or something like that. It's been a few years.
yeah, there were a couple effective combos. My main, if we're talking gameplay, my main things that I liked that were improvements over Persona, I think, was the sub Persona system. That let you assign more abilities than just what the character had, and so you were able to have more coverage. Kanji wasn't just the lightning guy anymore; he could be lightning and fire if you gave him a fire sub persona. It let you have more freedom with what characters you were using. The boost system that lets you cast a spell for free if you hit exploit a weakness really helped the persona combat system a lot, I think, because before it was just a matter of SP management. It was like, oh, I can either use my SP ability and just run out of SP for not much payoff, or I can just bash away with melee, which nothing has that much of a resistance to. But here, if you exploit a weakness, you got to do a cast for free, so you could zap somebody with a weakness from a sub persona and then use your most expensive instant kill ability for free the next turn. And so it felt very strategic to me. And then the biggest really for Persona Q though, once again for me, was story, as I thought the story was really beautiful, and part of it was the inspiration behind Chromatose, actually, because it infected me so much.
And that's really interesting. And thank you for sharing that. The where you got so the inspiration from and such. And I don't disagree because as you're talking about, it's reminding me, and yeah, Q did the way that Q was presented with the chain roll that you could do to, as you said, just blast off your most expensive skill, um, was was a real nice change of pace for when you're for SP management. And if a memory serves, something similar was kind of incorporated into Persona 5 and such, but being able, having something else do it before then, is a much needed quality of life uh, change when when a game is so dependent on you having to manage SP or manage health or basically just
Yeah,
micromanage everything to the point where if you don't, you're going to put yourself in a position where you're going to hurt yourself more, right?
yeah. Oh, one thing that does huge circle back Persona Q. One thing I really when they do it, um, they put horror in a non-horror game. That was incredible. Uh, the, the entire third dungeon was like a haunted house type level, complete with jump scares and enemies that stop you and follow you around. And there's something to be said about like horror games. You log in expecting horror, you get horror, and it's pretty scary. But playing a regular game and then getting thrown into horror mechanics is all it takes you with that sort of smash hit of surprise that horror games don't have because you're expecting it, and that almost feeds back into like Sucker for Love a little bit, where it kind of goads you, or DDLC, where it goads you in with cutesy, lightheartedness, and then surprise, it's actually horror mechanics, and you have to like survive now. It's I think it's one of my favorite things in video games when it does that.
Yes, and I agree because that dungeon was something I wasn't expecting, and it was it well it was I'm going to say a classic, so to say, Japanese kind of inspired horror story. It was all those dungeons were wildly unique, similar, not dissimilar from Persona 4 and such, but they were done in such an interesting way. And it was the new mechanics that they were able to introduce into them, instead of it just being, okay, well, here's a theme, here's a horror theme, here's a sauna theme or what have you. They were able to actually implement mechanics for those themes that were fitting, instead of just things that they would use elsewhere, right?
Yeah, it almost seems like they, because the games are like smaller, they have more creative freedom with it. They're allowed to, you know, uh, they don't have to go for the crowd pleaser, as we found. They I if I recall correctly, a lot of people really hated the horror section because they weren't there for a horror game and they weren't prepared for it. A lot of people really struggle to get through a jump scare heavy portion of the game, and so they took it after Persona Q2. Yeah, I'm pretty sure the publisher said, "Okay, we're not doing jump scare dungeons again because everyone hated it." But I thought it was incredible.
And I myself was not a fan of it, only because, well, partly because of the jump scares, as well as the game was a little difficult at times. And if I remember correctly, that was not a easy place, because by the time you were there in the game, you weren't at a level where you were able to easily exploit the enemies. So, you were getting jump scared by hard enemies, being chased by hard enemies. And, for me, my anxiety ran just a little too high for it. And I did my best to get through it. But I don't blame people, and I don't blame people for saying no. I'm sorry, this isn't for me. And I also don't blame Atlas for saying no, no, this isn't happening again. Please no. Now, Akabaka, like I said, I don't want to take too much more of your time, but I do want to sneak one more question in before I let you go, if you're okay with that.
Yeah, go ahead.
So, what kind of game would you like to make if you were given, the absolute freedom to just go to it?
Ooh, that's a good question. So, I would make an adult game with a AAA budget if I could make whatever I wanted. So one thing that I kind of you might get this impression from playing my games since they're very, very heavily romance and dating themed. Is I believe that games shouldn't be so shy of romantic themes and like sexual content and stuff. When literally next door, we can show like hyper realistic gore and war crimes. Like I can click over to Spec Ops: The Line, or hell, like I could name three AAA games where you can hire a prostitute and then kill her, but those same games won't like actually have the scene in it, and it's kind of surprising to me how people have got how draconian the video industry is with romantic themes, but not with anything else. Like 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 it's too taboo to show like a healthy romantic relationship, but at the same time, we can show highly realistic, visceral eye gouging in Dead Space 2 and have it just be on shelves. So I think I would want a game with like adult content, but it not is not about the content. It's like it'd be like a regular game like Fire Emblem or Persona with that's got like a core game and core gameplay, but has romantic themes in it and lets you carry them out, kind of like how Cyberpunk 2077 did, I think. Props to them for like actually putting romantic scenes in their game. But um, basically, what I'd do would be some sort of anime type game with a big budget, like a high quality Fire Emblem type or like Persona type, and then just have it also have adult content in it. I think would be my dream game.
And I understand where you're coming from with that, and I've heard that echoed a lot, and I don't disagree with the I don't disagree with where you're coming from for it, because you're absolutely correct. If literally, right on the shelf you already have this game where you are, like you said, for Dead Space, gouging out eyes and delimbing and stomping
Yeah,
on
or take like
weird
or
mutant
take like
babies.
Mortal Kombat stuff too. Yeah, or Mortal Kombat's X-ray scenes and whatnot. Yeah,
So, I completely understand where you're coming from, and I don't disagree. Uh so yeah, that's a really interesting, interesting approach to want to take for it. If I may circle back around to something we discussed earlier, it might honestly take Hideo Kojima before that is something that's seen as any kind of a norm.
yeah. Um,
But
I,
no, I think.
yeah.
Oh,
Uh,
sorry.
Cyberpunk 2077 actually did it, and I was kind of surprised by that. I don't know if you heard about that, but yeah, there's on-camera sex scenes in Cyberpunk 2077.
And that doesn't shock me per se, because CD Projekt Red did that with The Witcher, I believe, or at least some forms of it. And them pushing that boundary, that doesn't shock me. And likely I think the thing that likely made people not criticize them too much for that, um, was the fact that it wasn't the core gameplay. And it would be interesting just to see if there was something that was introduced in the future, in the same vein where it's just a normalizing effect to kind of maybe make it so it's not such a weird niche market. And I say that in the sense of, I am well aware that there are not a large like I'm well aware that they're not always niche in the sense of what they're catering to. However, it can go south very quickly. And I think having normalized ones in ways that are not handled similarly to, like, say, The Witcher for Cyberpunk, would probably just help make it something that people are a little less afraid to do when making games that are rated M or the equivalent, and such. But I think I think the unfortunate part of that is the challenge would be people or children effectively picking it up and going. And I say that only because I've firsthand watched a 12-year-old at best convince their mother that they needed Grand Theft Auto 3 or Grand Theft Auto San Andreas and they were only going to do everything that wasn't the drug related stuff. And they were okay with that. They were okay with the everything but the drug related stuff and the um the hooker stuff, right? So I don't know. I'm not trying to argue with you. I'm just trying to add that it's, the nuanced of how it would work is, I hope that that's something that can be worked out. And I forget the game that was coming out or has already kind of released, where a major studio was behind it. And as they wanted to go to GDG to talk about, and were denied, by their, from according to what they said, because they pioneered, as they said, breast physics. um, I think companies wanting to push stuff like that is an interesting approach, and you know hopefully that can be a thing in the future, because I know there's a market for it. And I think, again, because I don't want to get too far into it, and I think people that know are well aware of why. But a healthy market for it, I think, would be a fantastic thing to just exist. You know.
Hmm.
Sorry, and I know I didn't know, no way was I intending to say all that and make it sound like I was arguing or disagreeing with you. I was just trying to dance around my hopes for it in very specific ways.
Yeah, no, I understand, and I definitely see where you're coming from. The thing with the kids picking up the game, um, I mean, they could do that now with, say, Witcher or Cyberpunk if they talk their parents into it. But at the same time, I also think that there's definitely far worse on shelves in terms of horror, gore, crimes, war crimes at that, on shelves of pretty common games. Like I'm pretty sure you can see far worse than two adults in a healthy relationship in a video game, especially horror ones. In terms of things that will damage kids see it, two adults in a healthy relationship, I think, are kind of low on the list compared to uh, uh, the violence and gore that is all over the place and that we don't even bat an eye at. But that's, again, just my personal stance. That's kind of why that's why it's kind of my dream game, as in I dream about making it. Probably won't, but I don't know. Hey, if Sucker goes up, then that's, and Dread XP gets really cool with a lot of things very quickly, then who knows?
Yeah. Yes, and and thank you for the point you made. And I didn't think about it like that, and I understand. I agree completely. Is that, on the list of horrible things that a child could, or I shouldn't say a child, but a younger person or what have you could see, um, a healthy relationship between two adults is far lower on the horrible scale than what you can see in a lot of games in terms of gore and violence and everything that a lot of people just don't bat an eye to. And so thank you, because that is a good and interesting perspective, that I never actually thought of. So that's thank you. That's a good perspective. And hopefully, if everything goes right, maybe you can find a way in the future to pave that way. Or, as I said, fingers crossed that Hideo Kojima goes really crazy and gets a lot of money, and he paves that way for everyone else, and it's something that you don't have to worry too much about for what you're doing in the future. Anyway, Akabaka, as I said, I didn't want to take up too much more of your time. However, if there's anything else you want to discuss, a cool game, what you're doing, something you feel more people should be aware of, or just be aware of, the floor is yours. As well, please let everyone know where they can find more information about you, which I'll also include in the episode description.
Sure. So Sucker for Love is coming out fairly soon, and sometime after that, there will be more. As of now, there will be more Sucker for Love titles, including more gods and different player characters. I'm particularly excited for this next one, Sucker for Love Second Date, which features the Eldritch God, the Black Goat in the Woods. Not saying the Lovecraftian because it is a thinly veiled racial slur, but it'll be it turns a lot of mechanics from Sucker for Love 1 on its head. There'll be multiple threats at once. There will be moving about the houses. There will be um, uh, how do you describe it? Basically, it'll be akin to like a home invasion type sim where there are threats in your house and you're trying to avoid them. And it'll I'm pretty excited to share the stuff that comes from that with all of y'all soon. To follow along, I have my Twitter, which is Chromatose Dev. Um, but you can also just Google Akabaka or Sucker for Love Twitter, and it should come up. You can hear more about me, my games, and my projects by either following my Twitter, DreadXP's Twitter, or joining either of our Discords, which are on our Twitters.
Awesome, and thank you for sharing that, as well as a little bit more information about the follow up to Sucker for Love. That sounds like it's going to be incredibly fun and incredibly interesting to juggle all of that as well. Also looking forward to Chromatose because it sounds like it's going to be an interesting experience. And as I said, I'll also include links to that so people can easily click through and get to it for you
Great,
or
appreciate it.
to follow you. Now, Akabaka, if there wasn't anything else, I will let you get back to your day. Back to your busy schedule of working on two games and keeping those plates moving.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. Thank you. Well done.
Awesome, and thank you so much. Pleasure's all mine. I'm glad you enjoyed yourself, and yeah, just a huge thanks to you, Akabaka, for making the time to have this conversation with me, as well as thank you for joining us on the Red Tunic podcast, and a special thanks to Ron Jenkins for the use of the music from the title track from Road Steep. And if you like this podcast and want to support it and help it grow, please subscribe or follow me on Red Twitter. Follow me on Twitter at Red Tunic Podcast to receive the latest episodes and news, and be sure to share if those you think might also enjoy it. Thanks, and until next time.